So here's scenario 1. The student was EO and needs to be tested or was already tested and has to be reported with EL or IFEP. Okay, so if you'll notice, the student has an EO record with the status date of 9/8/2011. Adding a record, let's say an EL record right away or IFEP record, will trigger a SELA 255, which is an invalid change in an ELA status code because reporting an EL after an EO is not a valid um, change in the sequence. Okay, so to be able a workaround on this is first report the student with a TBD record. So um, report a TBD, and then once you reported a TBD, then you either report an EL or IFEP. This will only work if the student only has an EO record. If the student has other ELA status like an EL or a prior EL or IFEP, and then you're reporting another EL and IFEP, it will trigger a SELA 283. Okay, and that's another scenario that I will be discussing. For scenario 2, the student is EO but needs to be tested based on further evidence from the LEA. However, an old TBD record exists. In this scenario, we can leave both the EO and TBD record in CalPads. The LEA must submit their own TBD record with the start date in this current academic year. The reason behind that is because TOMS requires a TBD status date that is equal to or after July 1st of the current academic year, and a record associated to the current LEA to include the student on the initial LPAC roster. So both EO and TBD can be left as is, and the current LEA can just submit a SELA record with a TBD status with the status date of this current academic year. For scenario number 3, the student was incorrectly reported as IFEP based on further evidence from the LEA. So apparently, ABC Unified incorrectly reported an IFEP, and this should be an EL instead. So how do we approach this scenario? First are the considerations. The student has a SELA record of IFEP with a date after 7/1/2018. Okay, take note, after 7/1/2018. So if the date was before 7/1/2018, then we might have a problem because we won't be able to use a correction code. Okay, but since the IFEP date is after 7/1/2018, the approach is to just report the EL record and add a correction code of either a 2 or a 5. And that should be accepted by CalPads, and that should post at the top, and you'll have a TBD, an IFEP, and an EL. Now for scenario 4, we have the same student with the same ELAS scenario, ELAS history. So you have the IFEP and a TBD, and it turns out the student should have been an EO, English only. He should have not been tested, but then he was tested, but then now they want that status in CalPads changed into an EO, or at least have an EO status as the current status. So since the status date of the most recent status is 8/28/2018, which is after 7/1, the easiest way to approach this is to just add a new SELA record containing the new status and adding a correction reason code. So for this student, the student was IFEP, and so you want to report the student as EO, then you just indicate the correction reason code, either use a 3 or a 4, and then use an English primary language, and a status code of EO. You post it, and CalPads will then add the record on top of the IFEP. So now we have scenario number 5, wherein the student was reported with an incorrect ELA status with the date before 7/1/2018. So as you can see here, the student was IFEP on 9/2/2014. Apparently, the student should have been an EO instead. So you can't just, unfortunately, you can't just add a new SELA record and add using a correction reason code to approach this scenario. You can't do that because the status date of the record being corrected was before 7/1/2018. So in this case, your only resolution is to contact ABC Unified and request that they delete their IFEP record. And that's the only time they would allow you, or at least CalPAS would allow you to enter the EO status record in the system. However, before requesting LEAs to delete their records, you should have at least proof that this is a valid status that has to be reported in CalPADS. Okay, so again, student has an EL, IFEP, RFEP before 7/1 and you want to report an EO using a correction code will not work. The prior LEA has to delete the record. So let's now move on to scenario number 6, wherein the student needs to be an EL, but the most recent record is EO. So in the course of you uploading SINF records before or SELA records in CalPAS, and there were at one time no validations to capture all of these different ELA status, CalPAS now has multiple ELA status in the system. So now it turns out you misreported the student as EO before when he should have been maintained as an EL. So if you own the record, if you're Paramount Unified, this is an easy fix. You just go ahead and delete the EO record and let the EL record remain. Now, if you are not Paramount, again, you have to contact this LEA and request that they delete the EO record. And again, before requesting a deletion, you should have proof that the EL status should be the most current status of the student in CalPADS. So let's move on to scenario 7. In this case, the student needs to be EL, but the most recent record was EO. Okay, so if you'll notice, this LEA are similar. You have here SBE Dixon Montessori Charter and Dixon Montessori Charter. So apparently, Dixon Montessori Charter was initially under the State Board of Education umbrella. And then after some time, they were able to get out of it and became an IRC. However, in CalPADS, there are instances too wherein the original status date that you report has an effective start date that is later than the later ELA status date, or the supposedly most current status date. So in this scenario wherein the most current status date is now EO because the effective start date was later, if you have this scenario, the only way to approach this is to delete the offending record. So in this case, if you want the student to be EL, then you have to delete the EO record. Unfortunately, if you're one of these LEAs who came from an SBE status and became an IRC and have this scenario, the only way to be able to correct this is to send us a service ticket and request that we delete the record for you. The reason behind this is that you can no longer log in on your SBE account, because this is a closed school. And since we've moved from the old system to the new system, then the tables are already have already been changed a lot. So the only way to resolve this is to send us a service ticket. That way we can ask our engineers to delete it from the backend.